Hey, Presales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Richard Armstrong, Head of America's Solutions Engineering at Cloudflare. The topic of today's episode is the technical win. I am very excited for today's episode. Today's episode is a good one. Should you have technical win? Should you not have technical win? If you don't have technical win, how are you justifying your solutions engineering headcount? So in today's episode, Richard is going to talk to us about the technical win, why your organization needs technical win, and how it helps with accountability. You're going to notice I'm going to push Richard on a number of questions. I'm interested to hear your perspective after today's episode, so make sure you message me and let me know if you think pre-sales teams should be held accountable for the technical win. Today's episode is sponsored by Proverity. In this highly competitive, ever-changing environment, it is key to show continuous value. Proverity Cloud does just that by providing the necessary collaboration, crucial data, and real-time insights throughout the customer lifecycle so that pre-sales teams can remain agile and can unlock sustainable revenue growth. For more information, visit proverity.com. Richard, welcome to the Presales Podcast. How are you?
I am fantastic. Thanks a lot. I'm glad to be here, James.
I'm glad to have you, Richard. I feel like this is a long time coming. We've gotten to know each other over the past year or so, give or take, with Presales Collective and the Executive Council. And now you're on the podcast. And so it's my pleasure to have you here. And one of the things I want to ask you before we get started was, how are things at Cloudflare? Because you started at Cloudflare around 9 months ago. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it's been a wild ride, I'll tell you that. Cloudflare is a fantastic company, and I'm fortunate to be there. I went to Cloudflare because of their unique space in the market, and I wanted to have an experience of a full SaaS type solution company, which most of the companies I've worked at have been more on-premise type companies. They're also a mid-sized company that's in the process of growing quickly and changing. So I felt like I could bring my experience to the table and make an impact. And it's not been a disappointment at all.
That's great to hear. If you don't mind me asking, what has been maybe the biggest challenge from going to a hybrid solution or on-prem to a fully SaaS environment?
If anything, it's probably the speed of change. If you think that things move quickly at a on-premise type company where you have 18-month release cycles, is nothing compared to a SaaS solution where you have new features coming out every day. So I think that the ability for the company to release new features exceeds the ability of the field to be able to absorb it. And that creates an interesting challenge.
For sure. Well, I appreciate you sharing that, Richard. Before we get into today's episode, which is a very highly debated topic within pre-sales, which I'm excited to explore, I want to hear about you. Tell us how you stumbled into pre-sales.
As you know, the role of the SE, and I think we talked about this in the Executive Council years ago, it's not a traditional role. People fall into it maybe because they were sitting next to the computer when a sales guy needed a techie, right? And for me, what happened is I was a network analyst at Motorola, and we were a Cabletron Cisco shop, a very big Cabletron Cisco shop at the time. And we always had the Cisco sales rep and Cisco SE, and the same with Cabletron coming out. And my view of that was, hey, these are the sales droids that come and take us to lunch and give us a free lunch. Then I found out what the SE does, what their job is, and also found out how much they make. And I kind of went through this moment where I thought, well, this isn't fair. Life is not fair. How come he makes so much more money than I do, even though I know the Cisco products a lot better than he does, in my opinion? Then I realized, well, maybe it's something I should look at as a role. And that was back in the 92, 93 timeframe. Next thing you know, in early 96, I ended up working in a place called Tivoli Systems. It was my first SE job.
And here you are 20 years later, plus still working in pre-sales. So you must obviously enjoy it.
Yes, there's never a dull moment because things change so quickly. It's always entertaining. I really do think that the role of the SE is the best unknown career out there, period. You have one foot in technology, one foot in the business, and you're solving customer problems and you're never bored.
That's so well said, Richard. We both just referenced the Exec Council. Do you mind giving us a little bit of context into what the Exec Council is?
The Executive Council is something that was really started unofficially years ago. This was like around the 2007 timeframe. I was sitting talking with, at the time was Casey Choi, the VP of SE's HP. And we were kind of laughing about how we have common set of problems no matter what company we're at as SE leaders, right? We all have the same basic job and the same basic challenges. So why not get together as a leadership group and talk about those things? And the idea was, hey, leave your badge at the door. Let's get together. It doesn't matter if you're competing with me. We're going to talk about these fundamental things around SE leadership. And that started off with the Executive Presales Council way back when, which we ran for a few years with help from Casey and his team. Certainly Valerie Willick from Salesforce also had her thing going on. We ended up merging with them. And then eventually we merged with the Presales Collective. So I think that's been fantastic.
It's always great to hear the journey and the perspective. For those who don't know, the Leadership Collective really was an extension of the Executive Council. And that's how we've got to know each other over the past year. So I'm very fortunate for that and appreciate all the work that you and other leaders have put in to really make Presales Leadership Collective possible as it exists today.
Absolutely.
All right, Richard, we're getting into today's topic, and today's episode is the technical win. And I believe that this is a highly debated topic within pre-sales. You and I had talked about this prior to the podcast, and we think it's a topic that we need to put out there. And I know that you have a lot of opinions and a lot of experience here. So I'm looking forward to diving in today. So Richard, let's kind of start with the basic premise. What is the technical win?
I do think that different places have a different definition or even connotation of what the technical win is. However, I think it's important no matter what company you're at, that you tie that down and you get everybody on the same page. Sales, leadership, SE leadership, and the individual contributors on both sides need to understand what you mean when you say technical win. This definition that I'll share with you is something that I've evolved over the years that I firmly believe is the right solution. Other people might not agree, but I do think it makes sense. And so I have a very specific definition. A technical win means that the technical buyer, it's the person that typically can say no, but can't say yes, believes that your solution is the right solution for their environment to solve their critical business issues. They believe that it will work in their specific environment, and they're ready to recommend your solution to the economic buyer. The economic buyer is the person that has the budget, and recommend it above and beyond any other competing solutions, including the option of doing nothing.
That is the best definition of technical win that I've heard. And so for you, Richard, why do you believe that that is the proper definition of the technical win?
Well, it comes down to really identifying accountability for what the SE is supposed to do. As you know, the SE is a non-traditional role. We talked about that. And SEs can do a lot of things. They're capable of doing a lot of things and they want to help. So they often do a lot of things, often above and beyond what they're quote unquote held accountable to do. This is good because we're very helpful, but it's bad because you have to have a concise and precise definition and accountability for the business to know where you're moving the needle. And this gets to the crux of that definition of what the SE is supposed to do and what's accountable to do in a sales cycle. There's other things that SEs do that I think are also very relevant. For example, SEs are the face of the company when they're facing the customer, and they're the face of the customer when they're looking back to the company to provide guidance on features and potential future products and things like that. Those are all very relevant. But at the end of the day, if I had to boil it down, I'd say it boils down to the technical win. So in order to be able to measure that and report on that, you have to define it.
So as we talk about the technical win, how is it secured within a sales cycle?
It comes down to really understanding how a different company defines the sales cycle. But I do believe that it inherently needs to happen no matter how you define the sales cycle. And by that, I mean that a decision maker that is the budget holder needs to be informed to make a decision. Typically, if that decision maker is not informed, they will not make a decision. And in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, you need to cover the bases. And one of the key bases is going to be technical validation. In other words, that person needs to believe that it's been vetted, that it's going to work in their environment, and that when they invest this money, they're not going to look bad and maybe even lose their job. So no matter how you do technical win, it's got to happen somehow.
Some of the things that you mentioned are the actual technical validation. So what are some ways that pre-sales professionals can technically validate the product?
I use the term technical validation on purpose. A lot of people will say proof of value or proof of concept. I call it technical validation because I think it's broader than that. I do think proof of concept or proof of value is a subset of it. But the way that you secure it is you make sure that the economic buyer understands the things that we discussed about when we define the technical win. In order for that technical buyer to feel comfortable that it works in their environment, you have to achieve that technical validation. And that can be anything from, on one end of the spectrum, as simple as a customer reference to another company that looks just like them, with another technical buyer at the other company that maybe even knows the guy at your company. That's maybe the simplest way to do a technical validation, where the most risky and the most complex and time-consuming end of it would be a production proof of concept, where they're not leaving anything to chance. It's been rolling in production for some amount of time before they are convinced that it's validated. I think the key for sales is to control the risk in the sales cycle and the time in the sales cycle. So it's important for the sales leaders and the SE leaders and the salesperson, the SE, to be able to identify the least risky and the least time-consuming way to achieve that validation.
That's a great definition. I actually want to come back to POCs and POVs because I think that you're right. They're a subset of the technical validation. Now, as a pre-sales leader, do you create something like a Presales Toolbox or toolkit for the SEs to be able to get that technical validation so that they know pretty much what levers they can pull to get that validation in the process?
Yes, absolutely. And we talk about how things change a lot. The technology changes. As I said, I started doing the SE role in the mid-90s, and the technology has changed a lot since then. But some of the things that haven't changed are that you need to do proof of concepts. That's always been there. And that if you are going to do a proof of concept, you have to identify best practices for your company, for your solution and your products that work. And the way you do that is, to some extent, you have trial and error and you identify the best practice for that particular scenario. Then you capture that and you create templates and tools to get that done. I say that in a very generic way because it's different for different companies, but you always have to identify what are the success criteria, what is the time frame for it. You have to identify when is the right time in the sales cycle to do it. And then you have to follow through and show that you met those criteria. And you have to do that in a way that you control scope. I'm sure everybody has horror stories or battle scars based off of running proof of concepts that kind of take a course of their own. And the only way to avoid that is to have some discipline around how you do them.
You're exactly right, Richard. So many of us get thrown into POCs or POVs because we think it might be the next step in the sales process, when in reality, that's not what's actually needed to get that technical win or technical validation. So let me ask you a specific question here that just come to mind is, what do you do if you're an SC and you're getting that technical validation and you believe that the customer has said, hey, James, we're going to move forward with your product, but your salesperson is offering more. They're offering that hands-on trial of the product, but you don't actually believe it's the right move and it's actually overkill at that point. How would somebody handle that?
That gets into interpersonal relationships and communications, ways to do that. By far, the best way is if you have an environment where you have mutual respect between the salesperson and the SE, to have a discussion. I've had many discussions, and sometimes heated, when I was an SE. What's the right step to do? Why should we do it? And hopefully that gets resolved at that point in time. And I'd say 90% of the time it does. However, I think it's important to have that, I'd say, healthy conflict around it, right? If that healthy conflict does not resolve the issue and the SE still feels passionate about, or they're firm on their stance that this should not happen at this point in time, I think the SE should be able to go to the SE manager. And then it's the same thing. It's what's the relationship between the SE manager and district manager on the sales side? Can they have a conversation that makes sense? Because we all know that everything doesn't always work perfectly. I think that 99% of the time it's resolved there. And then it goes on up. But it really comes down to, does the SE have a voice in the sales cycle and how the sales progress is viewed? That is owned by the SE leadership, and how the sales leadership views the SE leadership and the SE organization.
Richard, you just said so many things that I want to follow up on. So I really appreciate that response because there's a lot to unpack here. One of the things that we talk about a lot with Presales Collective is this concept of healthy friction and the idea that you have two people approaching a problem and deciding what's best versus kind of that, hey, this is the way we're going to do things. SE, go do it. That kind of sales support versus co-pilot mentality. So in your experience, if the SE's in the situation where they've had to escalate to the SE manager, how does the SE manager go about navigating that conversation with the leaders to make sure that there is that level of accountability between both pre-sales and sales, but that level of friction that will allow for the SE to be able to say no? Because I've even felt this myself, that there's been so many times in my career, because I report into sales, especially in smaller companies, I'm automatically vetoed in that situation because I'm not carrying the quota.
It comes down to the level of trust and respect that is shared across sales and SE and sales leadership and SE leadership. And I think that the SE leadership and the SEs need to own that, right? If you approach sales from the standpoint of, hey, I'm a techie and I know how this stuff works and I can do all this cool technical stuff, that's good. Those are table stakes. You should be able to do that. You need to go above and beyond that and start having a discussion about what it means from a business standpoint. You need to start talking about risk in the sales cycle. You need to start talking about how are you going to optimize the overall district number to overachieve on that number. When you start doing that as an SE, when the SE leader starts doing that and having those conversations with their sales counterparts, then all of a sudden that conversation can happen and they listen to you and trust you. Are you going to win 100% of the time? No. But sometimes it may have very good reasons for doing that you hadn't thought about. I'll give you one anecdote, and this is very early in my career at Tivoli Systems. We were in a very complex sale at Bequiven, which is a petroleum company in Venezuela. This was back in the mid-90s. It was a very complex sale because it was a combination of 5 different companies that had come together to do Bequiven. And my sales rep put it on the quote-unquote bet the farm forecast, which means that we knew that was going to close. And I knew darn well it should not be there. So I sat there and talked to my rep and said, played sales manager, right? And it was like, how can you put this on the bet the farm forecast when you know that this is so complex and we've only done maybe 20% of the work we should do? How can you do this? And she looked at me and stiffened up a little bit. And so she said, well, because my boss said, if I don't put it on the bet the farm forecast, I'm going to get fired. I'm like, wow, right? But guess what? We ended up closing that deal for $6 million. We figured out a way to do it. And I would have never in my life thought that it would close. However, we did it. We went to each individual part of the company, sold it separately to them, and finally brought it together for the CIO level and managed to close that deal. So it was a lesson for me. I'm not always right just because I think I know all the technology answers and I understand the sales process. Sometimes it takes a little bit of faith to go make it happen.
I really appreciate you sharing that story. I know that almost every single person listening has a very similar story, right? Because sometimes as SEs, we're like, there's no way this deal is going to close, but there's a little bit of art and science that just happens in sales. And I think that's where that healthy friction comes into play. So I'm glad you shared that story. You're right. And sometimes that's how sales managers will kind of will us to a deal at times. But you mentioned something earlier that has really resonated with me, in this idea of accountability in the pre-sales process, and that being a techie and relevant customer conversations and knowing product are really table stakes, but they're not what move the needle with finance. And so talk to me about accountability in the sales process as it relates to the technical win.
Absolutely. And again, I'll go back in time and think about how far we've come as an industry and as a profession. We have come a long ways. However, when I think about some of the challenges that we have stalled to an extent, early on, nobody even knew what the SE does. Finance just heard that they needed to have some budget for SEs because sales needed it. And so they allotted some. There was really no accountability in terms of what the SE did or didn't do that was visible to finance. Come forward 25 years, and we really haven't done a lot there, to be honest with you. I think we have moved the needle some, and we have reporting capabilities that we didn't have before, which is fantastic. But at the end of the day, if you want to have a seat at the table, you need to understand what you're accountable for. You need to measure that have continuous improvement for it, and you need to report it in a way that you show finance how you move the needle. If we don't do that as an SE industry, we will never have a seat at the table, and we'll always be having that argument about why is sales getting all the headcount instead of SEs when we do all the work. It's that simple. You need to have visibility, measurability, and reporting to it. At the end of the day, we can go on without that accountability indefinitely, I think, because sales inherently knows that the resources are needed, that understand the technology and can link the underlying technology to the business value. However, as SE leaders, we have much deeper visibility to what's happening. And we believe that we can increase sales productivity, we can shorten sales cycles, we can increase deal size just through understanding the competitive landscape, through being able to do better technical discovery, being able to do better technical validation. If we believe that we can do that, and we are doing that, but we're not reporting on it, then we're doing a disservice to the company.
So Richard, that is really something that I'm sure that there are many people listening that are probably questioning themselves, especially leaders, and saying, hey, am I getting that true seat at the table? And is it because of the lack of accountability in the sales process? Because you're right. We continue to say pre-sales is absolutely needed in the sales process. They're vital to customer experience. They're vital to buyers. But at the end of the day, we haven't had the best way to measure and quantify this role, because it's easy for finance or a CRO or a CEO to say, hey, we're going to throw salespeople at the problem because we can manage the quota and quota attainment. But the pre-sales professional still to this day is somewhat lacking in terms of how we justify the headcount or justify the existence. And so I'm glad that you talked about that. So what are some ways that you measure the technical win as it relates to potentially the CRM?
The best way that I've done it so far has been where it has been a defined step in the sales cycle and is defined within the CRM. So we can report on it, we can have accountability to it. And the way we did that is through technical validation step. And it got to the point to where sales will look at that and say, hey, if you forecasted these opportunities to close in this quarter and you're 6 weeks into the quarter, but the technical validation hasn't happened, then why is this being forecast? Should it be forecast? I'm not saying that it shouldn't be, but at least the question happens and the visibility to it happens.
And then making it part of the culture, making it part of the process, have salespeople actually wanting to get SEs involved in making this technical validation part of the process so that there's dual accountability throughout. I want to ask you a little bit different of a question. So technical win and the measurement there helps build the justification for the headcount. What are some other ways that you as a leader have measured the pre-sales impact to justify the existence?
One is, were you able to grow the opportunity during discovery? We'll look at a lot of details around proof of concept or proof of value and discipline around that. What was the win rate for successfully closing these proof of concepts? How many are being done? How long did it take? All the things that you can imagine around that. And we also look at and report on what are the features that we're driving into future product, or are there future products that we're driving into the company based off feedback from the customer? Because they will tell us things that they would not tell product management or even sales. So we have a unique position to be able to do that. Those are the key areas, when I look at and say, this is where the SEs are contributing. There's some other things that you can look at around deals that had SEs involved that won or didn't win versus deals that were won where there was no SE involved. What's the difference? Were the deal sizes bigger? Was the sales cycle longer or shorter? If you're able to capture those key things, I think that you can report on it. Where I stop is I'm not a fan of making the SEs enter a bunch of time tracking information. So I think it's kind of self-defeating. I think it's important that we use intelligence into things that we're already measuring to infer those things, whether it's through intelligent reporting or even using machine learning to really identify those things. That is the way that we should start doing that and reporting off of it.
Very well said, Richard. I absolutely agree on measuring all these items and being able to quantify the impact and using AI and machine learning to not have our team spending too much time doing administrative tasks, because I know that this is a hot topic and it's a debatable topic. So I want to talk about advice. And so there's people out there that are sitting here saying, you know what, this makes sense, right? I need to be able to measure the impact of my team for justification. And I think doing it through TechWin makes sense. How do they go about that in the organization? Because that's not something that happens overnight. There's an organizational shift that needs to happen. So where should people start?
The SE leadership should start by having frank discussions with sales leadership about it, and then be willing to put their neck out there and say, I want to be held accountable for this. I'm willing to live or die by the measurement of this. And I want to run the SE organization as a business, not just as a good old boy organization. That's where it starts, period.
Richard, for pre-sales, right? You mentioned that we maybe stalled a little bit in terms of the existence and the data and the tech win over the last couple of years. So where do you see this role going? And where do you see it going in terms of justification 5 to 8 years from now?
Wow, that is a really good question. To try to guess anything even a year from now in technology is difficult, right? I see the role of the SE potentially going in different ways. Really, at the end of the day, it's depending on the needs of the business, right? But I can see the role of the SE in a pure pre-sales capacity, reporting up independently of sales into the CRO, where they are held accountable and they have P&L. That's one potential way to do it. Alternatively, and to some extent, I see a need to mix pre and post sales to an extent, especially with SaaS companies. It's not clear yet whether that's the right way to do it or not, but I do see some focus on that. And I think really what it means is that especially SaaS organizations, but arguably all companies, should look not only at the immediate need of transferring our assets from our books to the customer's books, to looking beyond that and saying, hey, what are the business outcomes that the customer has? How do we take an ownership role in helping that customer reach those long-term business outcomes to have a long-term relationship with this customer? That's what I think is driving this. It doesn't have to be that you mix the organizations together, but maybe having leadership ownership at the top that owns both. That might be a way that we see that happening over time as well.
That's great. Richard, I really appreciate your perspective today. And I appreciate you going out there on a limb and saying what you believe the pre-sales profession might be in a couple of years. And thank you for all your work with the Executive Council and now Presales Leadership Collective. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
Pleasure speaking to you too, James. Thanks.
All right, Presales Collective. I really appreciate Richard's perspective on the technical win today because I know it's an important topic for our profession. And there's a lot to unpack in today's episode. But where I want to start is that I really like Richard's definition of the technical buyer and the economic buyer. The technical buyer isn't always the IT person that many of us think of, but it could be a marketing buyer, a sales buyer, etc. But someone who can say no, but they usually can't say yes because they don't have the budget to pay for it. And that's where that economic buyer comes into play. Richard's main premise of the technical win is it holds pre-sales people accountable in the sales process and also helps us measure our impact on the business. Richard also discussed a few other measures like growing the opportunity via disco, win rates on POC or POVs, feedback into product innovation. These reporting measures will allow us to justify our existence within organizations. One of the things that Richard said is that being technical and customer-centric are table stakes of this role. And it really is the truth. How do we make sure that the pre-sales professional has true justification in terms of how you grow and scale this role? And so for Richard, he discussed a number of things that could be in the pre-sales professional's toolbox, but all of them ultimately roll up into the technical win. Near the end of the episode, Richard talked about his suggested actions for leaders and said that leaders should put themselves out there to be held more accountable. I know early in my career, I had felt that I had great measures of my pre-sales team's impact on the business, but we did lack that accountability when it came to do we throw more sales or pre-sales head at the situation? And that happens to a lot of organizations. And so again, I really appreciate Richard's perspective on putting out the technical win. But at the end of the day, when Richard and I were talking about topics for today's episode, I wanted to put this out there because I do feel it can be somewhat controversial. Should pre-sales people be held for the technical win or should they not? What is the technical win? How is it defined? And it is different in every business, but I really like the fact that we need more accountability in our profession to get to where we want to go. Elevating the role of pre-sales is happening all over the globe right now. And that's what we want with Presales Collective. And I'm really interested to hear how other people are justifying the existence Are you instituting a technical win? How are you holding your pre-sales team accountable to make sure that you have that seat at the table? And something that I've been calling it is the strategic seat at the executive table. How do we get pre-sales, sales engineering, solutions engineering in that executive seat? So as I said in the introduction, I would love to know what you think of this episode. Please reach out to me on Slack. Let me know if you agree or you disagree, or why not pre-sales professionals should be utilizing the tech win. I look forward to continuing the conversation. Message me one-on-one in Slack. All right, Presales Collective, as always, I will see you next week.